What's going on, Packer fans? Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Really appreciate you joining me today. While we're going to get into today's episode in just a moment, I do want to remind you that tomorrow I will be joined once again by Mike Wall. I'm already super jacked for that episode, so make sure to check that out and subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't check out Mike's episodes a season ago, you are in for an absolute treat. He is one of the best at breaking down everything. So again, make sure to check that out tomorrow. But that is tomorrow. This is today, and we've got a lot to discuss. I'm really excited about my main topic, which I'll get to in just a moment. But we did have some news and notes from 1265. So let's go over those first. The biggest news is we had some players return from injury, and it starts with Allen Lazard. He returned to practice, and it sounds like he did in fact do a little bit of team activities, so that could be a really good sign for Allen Lazard this week. Meanwhile, David Bakhtiari and Elgton Jenkins did return to practice. We don't know if they did any team activities. They were listed as limited in practice, so not sure what that means yet. I would be shocked. I would be beyond shocked if they're not both listed as questionable going into Sunday, and we'll just have to wait and see once again as we get the inactives if in fact they are playing or not. But good sign that both of them did return to practice in some capacity. Meanwhile, Keyshawn Nixon and Quay Walker, who both exited last week's game with shoulder issues, they were both practicing and both were listed as full participants in practice. You would think that that would be a great sign for both of those players going into this week and for their availability on Sunday. Meanwhile, the Packers did add a new player. They added safety Mike Brown to the practice squad. He takes Caleb Jones's spot. And then when Matt LaFleur was asked about Zach Tom and his potential to start this week, Matt LaFleur did mention that he is in contention to start this week. Now, a couple things. It could be something, right? It could be that he's legitimately in the conversation to start as one of the top 5 offensive linemen. It could be totally much ado about nothing, right? In a couple ways. If all of a sudden Bakhtiari and Jenkins back are both those guys are back, the odds that Zach Tom has a spot on the offensive line is probably less. It's probably much more slim, right? Secondly, it could be much ado about nothing because if John Runyon Jr. is out this week and Bakhtiari and Jenkins are out this week, then Zach Tom is a starter by default, right? He's just going to be in there no matter what. They're not starting any of the other guys ahead of him, so he is a default starter. It could also be much ado about nothing because he probably would have said that about just about everyone. Yeah, they're in the conversation to start this week. Like, it's always a competition, right? So who knows? I think ultimately it seemed like Matt was being transparent of like, yes, he will be in the competition for a starting spot going forward. And I think that's true. I think he saw Jake Hansen, Royce Newman struggle in preseason, struggle in regular season. What decision they make moving forward, especially when they get guys back like Elgton Jenkins and David Bakhtiari. We'll see what happens with John Runyon Jr. There's a lot on the offensive line that's in flux at the moment, but I do think Zach Tom is at minimum in contention, and that will be worth keeping an eye on moving forward. Maybe the most interesting note of the day is that Aaron Rodgers was asked about Amari Rodgers and specifically his fit within the offense. And it was a very interesting answer from Aaron Rodgers. He said, quote, "Yeah, he's returning for us right now. That's all I got on it," unquote. So he was asked about Amari Rodgers' specific role in the offense. Now, couple this with the fact that Amari Rodgers did not play a single snap on offense last week. Not a single snap, despite being down, despite maybe needing to try different things. 0 snaps on offense for Amari Rodgers. When asked about it, Aaron Rodgers basically said, "Yeah, he's a returner." Like, I'm paraphrasing a bit there, but he basically said, "Yeah, he's our returner." That's it. So people, read into this differently. Some people were like, it was, disrespectful. Others are like, what is he supposed to say in that situation? Compare that to how he's talked about the rookies and that, hey, they're coming along and we need to be patient, and has basically said really good things, especially about Dobbs and Watson. Like, that was I believe that was a specific non-answer. To me, I don't know if that's a nail in the coffin for Amari Rodgers, but it is not a great sign because remember, struggled the season ago in basically all facets, didn't get a ton of time on offense. He's apparently in better shape this year. He's their kick returner, he's their punt returner, but there are 7 wide receivers on this active roster and Juwan Winfrey on the practice squad. And it does not, remember, basically all of those guys, not named Allen Lazard, played, but besides Smarturi, who was inactive, of course, but Juwan Winfrey got in the game. Dobbs got in the game, Watson got in the game, Cobb got in the game, and Lazard's clearly going to be involved once he gets active. Sammy Watkins got in the game. So like everyone else got in the game besides Amari Rodgers and Samori Toure. Toure more understandable, and again, he was inactive for the game. Rodgers did not. So pair that with Aaron Rodgers' response. To me, like this is just trending in a very poor direction. And it would seem to me, and we'll see, but it would seem to me that if Amari Rodgers was a 7th round pick or a undrafted guy or maybe even a 5th or 6th round pick, I think there's a good chance he would not be on this roster because yes, he is their kick returner. He is their punt returner. Let's just be real. He's not dynamic at either. And I don't even know if he's, their best option at either, to be honest. So if that's all he brings to the table is his returning ability and they don't have plans on playing him on on game day at wide receiver, running back, something like, I don't know, like you're just keeping him because he's a 3rd round pick at that point. And clearly, Aaron Rodgers could have said like, hey, we've got a lot of faith in Amari, but like, this is going to be a week to week thing. And there's going to be a lot of competition out there. He's like, yeah, he's a kick returner. He's a returner for us. Like that apparently is all they sort of see him as right now. And that's not a great sign that apparently 3rd round curse continues for the Green Bay Packers. We'll see what happens with him. I still think there's some talent there. I don't know. He hasn't exactly been dynamic in anything that he's done so far. And when you're a gadget type player, like you basically kind of need to be dynamic and he hasn't been. So we'll see. Last news, not from Green Bay side of things, but from Chicago side of things. Their offensive lineman, Alex Leatherwood, was put on the non-football injury list with mono. He'll be out 4 weeks, including this week against the Packers. Not a huge deal. He was not expected to have any role in that game, but they do lose one of their backup offensive linemen for this week. All right, that does it for news and notes. Let's get to main topic for today. And I'll be real. This is a fun one. I think this is like one that I'm going to really enjoy doing, but it's also one that I generally try to stay away from more often than not. So I want to talk about a decision that the Packers maybe could have done this past offseason and didn't. And in hindsight and looking at it now, I think it was a pretty big mistake. Now, the reason I don't usually talk about this is because if anyone is a fan of wrestling, pro wrestling, whether it's WWE, AEW, NXT, whatever it is, everyone wants to be the booker, right? Everyone likes to fantasy book matches and like what would happen. And it's like, honestly, one of the most fun things about being a wrestling fan is you think of all these dream matches that you could make and so on and so forth. In football, we do the same thing, right? We Monday morning quarterback, we fantasy football GM, we Madden GM, we Madden play the games, we constantly call out the GM for what moves we think we should have been done. It's all part of the fun. But in reality, it doesn't always work this way. There's a lot that goes into it, whether it's salary cap, whether it's trade value. And I think as fans, we tend to overvalue certain players, big names, etc., and undervalue, younger guys who have a lot of potential and those sort of things. So it's not always easy to do, and I try to avoid it. But sometimes I'll put together videos or articles of like 5 players the Packers could trade for at the trade deadline or things like that. Those are more like, interesting suggestions. I try to stay away from calling out of like, okay, this player was available on the trade block and Brian Gutekunst was an idiot for not going and getting them. Because again, there's just so much that goes into that. But today, I'm going to fantasy book this a little bit, and I'm going to put on my GM hat, and I'm going to go over a trade that I think was available for Green Bay, potentially, we'll go over that, and why I think Green Bay should have attacked it more aggressively. So before we get there, let's go through this offseason, right? So Packers trade away Davante Adams, which was the big sort of, the fulcrum of what this offseason, what was going on in this offseason. Like everything sort of surrounded that where they trade him, and then because of that, they pick up the additional picks, 22 and 53, but also they gain a ton of salary cap space, right? Which allows them to sign guys like Javon Reed, Sammy Watkins, re-sign Devondre Campbell, re-sign Rasul Douglas, sign Keyshawn Nixon, etc., etc. Pat O'Donnell. It gave them some funds that they were able to use to keep their own guys and to go out and sign some guys. So just pausing it right there, it's really tough to say if Davante Adams would not have been traded, who would they have been able to keep? I think they would have been able to keep Campbell. I think they probably don't bring in Sammy Watkins. I don't know if they bring in Javon Reed. I think maybe they bring in Reed. I think Douglas is probably gone. I think they still bring in Nixon, but some of those things are just really tough to say because the salary cap starts getting very, very tight. But they do make the trade. And what I think is also important to note here is that it has been confirmed by the Packers that they offered Davante Adams as much or more than what the Raiders offered Davante Adams in a contract. So they were willing to spend that money to keep a top-end wide receiver in Davante Adams and keep him in the fold. And again, I think that's worth noting. So the other thing that's worth noting here is that clearly, as they moved up using 2 of their second-round picks for Christian Watson and a wide receiver, they knew that they needed to attack the wide receiver position in some capacity. It's also worth noting here of who they actually had at wide receiver going into draft day. They had Allen Lazard, Randall Cobb, Sammy Watkins, Amari Rodgers, Juwan Winfrey, Malik Taylor, and Chris Blair. They had 7 wide receivers. And really, we can take Malik Taylor and Chris Blair off that list because clearly nothing came of those 2. So they basically had Lazard, Cobb, Watkins, Rodgers, and Winfrey. We just talked about Amari and how he's not really working out. Winfrey's on the practice squad. So in actual wide receiver land, they had Allen Lazard, Randall Cobb, and Sammy Watkins that they thought, could be contributors for them going into the season. They knew they had to take a wide receiver. They knew they needed to be aggressive at that position. Pick 16 comes up, and the Commanders take Jahan Dotson. By that time, Drake London, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jamison Williams, and Jahan Dotson were all off the board. The only receiver likely with a first-round grade for most teams at that point that was left in the draft was Treylon Burks. He would go at pick 18 a couple picks later. Now, again, as I mentioned, Green Bay clearly had intentions of getting a wide receiver. They traded up for Christian Watson. They ended up taking Romeo Doubs. They end up taking Samori Toure. So they take 3 wide receivers using 4 picks, 2 premium picks in the 2 second rounders to go up and get Watson. So this is clearly a position that they felt they needed to attack. And that brings me to pick 18. And no, I'm not talking about going up and getting Treylon Burks. It's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the trade that was made at pick 18 that sent A.J. Brown to the Philadelphia Eagles for pick 18 and pick 101, a first-round pick and a late 3rd-round pick, what was a compensatory 3rd-round pick. So 18 and 101 for A.J. Brown. That was the trade. There was no other conditions. There was no other anything. It was pick 18, pick 101, for A.J. Brown. The Titans would go on and select Treylon Burks with that 18th pick and then still had pick 101 a little bit later. And here is where I think the mistake was made. Because to me, if A.J. Brown was available, which he clearly was, I believe Green Bay erred in not going more aggressively after A.J. Brown. And here's why I want to attack this in a few different ways. And here's why I ultimately think that this is the case. This is a win now team with Aaron Rodgers. And I know that any good GM is giving themselves outs long-term and avenues long-term to be successful and not have that dip along the way, right? Brian Gutekunst is trying to avoid a complete all-in situation right now that's going to completely mortgage 2024, 2025, 26, 27, etc., and put them in no man's land with no opportunity to succeed. Right now, you look at this roster and, 3 years from now, you could have Jordan Love at quarterback, A.J. Dillon at running back, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Samori Toure at wide receiver. Probably need to find a tight end, but guys maybe like Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, Royce Newman, Zach Tom, Rasheed Walker, Caleb Jones, multiple other, there are a couple other guys out there on offensive line. Defensive line could be Devontae Wyatt, maybe even still Kenny Clark at that point. Maybe Jonathan Ford, edge rusher, probably still Rashawn Gary. Probably need to find your other one. Maybe Kingsley Enagbare, I guess I should say. Inside linebacker, probably led by Quay Walker. Corners probably still led by Jair Alexander, Eric Stokes, and maybe you have a Darnell Savage at safety, or maybe that's a position that you have to attack. But you look 3-4 down, years down the line, and they've got a core there that could have some success pending what Jordan Love becomes, right? But he's leaving himself out long term by not just going and going after a ton of veterans and forsaking the future in its entirety. And I get that, I understand that. But a trade for A.J. Brown would have been both a win-now move and a long-term move. It was actually the best of both worlds. And you could argue it was a best of both worlds in a situation that was probably even better than Davante Adams, because you get a win-now wide receiver, but he's 25 years old and he just turned 25. And he would be around for this current team, and then he'd be around for the potential start of the Jordan Love era if that happens in a year or two. We don't know. But even if Rodgers stays for 2, 3, 4 years, A.J. Brown will be there for that too. So A.J. Brown presented this amazing opportunity to both win now and still have a young player for the future. So let's then discuss, like, okay, what would have the cost have been? So if you look at every trade value chart, and you can look at there's all different shapes and sizes of draft pick trade value chart, but pick 28, their Devontae Wyatt pick, and pick 53, the first of their second rounders that they ultimately traded up to get Christian Watson, would have been more trade value points by all the charts than what the Titans actually gave up for A.J. Brown. So let's just play this out for a second. And it's, again, this is fantasy booking it. This is the benefit of some hindsight. I'm not arguing that it's not, but let's just say that happens, right? Pick 28 and pick 53. The Titans say, yeah, that's actually a better deal than what the Eagles are offering. We get a first round pick and then we get a pretty, early to mid second rather than a really late third. Like the difference between 53 and 101, that's like 50 basically 50 picks going in from end of round 3 to early to mid round, or basically mid round 2. That is a massive jump. And you're only going down 10 spots in round 1. And again, if you look at the trade value chart, that is a better package than what the Titans ultimately offered them. So you get A.J. Brown in that deal. You still pick Quay Walker at pick 22. You no longer need to trade up for Christian Watson in round 2 because you just got A.J. Brown. You still have pick 59. So remember, you don't have Devontae Wyatt anymore. So let's take a look at the next best defensive lineman on the board. There's only one. He was taken at pick 76, so a little bit later. But Travis Jones, who goes to Baltimore, looked awesome in preseason, ended up with an injury, so didn't play. Didn't play week 1. He's probably going to be out a couple weeks yet, but he looked fantastic in preseason. If you were able to pick, well, they would have been able to pick Travis Jones there. I don't know if he would have been high on their board or not. A couple other guys that probably would have been just based on their style, edge rusher Drake Jackson or tight end Jelani Woods. Those could have been guys that they went for as well, just based on, again, usually the type of players that they like. But man, imagine they get Travis Jones in that spot. And now you basically have just traded, Devontae Wyatt and Christian Watson for A.J. Brown and Travis Jones. And that is a massive difference. Like, you have a win now wide receiver. You still have a good defensive lineman. That's a rotational 5th defensive lineman anyway. And you go from Watson to A.J. Brown. That's a huge deal. So I think that would have been basically, and I'm using the players now, but like even going into the draft, right? So Green Bay probably has an idea that they have Quay Walker at 22 that they really like around this time. And at pick 28, they probably had a handful of guys that they like, clearly led by Devontae Wyatt. And, I think they knew that they wanted to trade up. They were trying to trade to the end of the first round to get Christian Watson using those 2 second round picks. They weren't able to get it done. But again, if you're looking at that and thinking, all right, instead of drafting Devontae at pick 28 and Watson and moving up to get a guy like Christian Watson, we could go get A.J. Brown and still have a late second round pick that we can attack, defensive line later if need be, or just take best player available there. To me, that is a much better alternative. So the cynic, I know what you're thinking already. Okay, Andy, that all sounds okay, but like you have to think of the salary cap. They already signed all those guys. They re-signed Devondre Campbell. They re-signed Rasul Douglas. They signed Sammy Watkins. They made all those moves already. They don't have the salary cap space to bring in an A.J. Brown on a 4-year, $100 million deal. He wanted a huge deal. So this is all much ado about nothing. It doesn't work, except it does. A.J. Brown this year is making $5.68 million. Green Bay has that money covered right now in salary cap space and still slush money left over for moves the remainder of this season. Next year, he makes $8.32 million against the salary cap. Easy money to fit within the salary cap next year. No issue whatsoever. The year after that, $12.43 million. Now, it is backloaded, and 4 or 5 years from now, you're going to be paying for A.J. Brown, but dude's going to be 29 at that point. Like, he's still in the prime of his career. And the way that salary cap revenues are set to go up with new TV deals should not be an issue. They'll have much more salary cap flexibility down at that time than they do now. Also, if all of a sudden you go from, Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love, you're no longer competing. I think even in that situation, you still want some receivers to help Jordan Love out. Even if you're like, you know what, we need to do a soft rebuild, AJ Brown would have trade value in 3-4 years. He just would. Like, he's going to still be that dude. He's still going to be a really good football player. He's still going to be in the prime of his career. So to me, the salary cap works here as well. There's no issue with adding him to the salary cap. So you could fit AJ Brown on that contract right now. And yes, AJ Brown is a little bit older than Christian Watson, but by 2 years. Brown just turned 25, Watson turned 23. Like, it's not that big of a deal. And if you did go this route where you get Travis Jones, he's a year and a half younger than Devontae Wyatt. So you basically broke even on age in this entire thing as well. Now, there are some real obstacles that we need to discuss here. The first is that what if Tennessee just wanted Treylon Burks at pick 18 and they weren't willing to wait till pick 28 to try to get a wide receiver? And even though that Green Bay's package was better by sending pick 28 and 53, maybe they're just like, yeah, that's great, but we can't get Treylon Burks at that point. That's the guy that we really want. Well, I asked two Titans writers, Teron Davenport and Paul Karofsky, what they thought. And Teron Davenport said he thinks Tennessee would have taken the best package available. But he did note that they really liked Burks, and that could have been a factor as well. Paul Karofsky said they really wanted Treylon Burks, and that was the reason they did the deal, is because they wanted Treylon Burks. Well, clearly Burks would not have been there at pick 28. And at that point, you probably need to start talking about pick number 22. Okay, that's a possibility. And really, there was nobody between pick 18 and 22 that would have picked a wide receiver unless Philadelphia at pick 18 decided to go with Treylon Burks. And maybe they would have, but I feel like if they liked Treylon Burks that much, they would have just taken him instead of trading for AJ Brown. And they didn't do that. They traded for AJ Brown. So a part of me feels like they didn't have Burks rated that high. And then if you look at the next picks, like the next team that wanted a wide receiver was Green Bay at 22. And now that you avoid that because AJ Brown's going to Green Bay. So there's a good chance that Burks would have been there at pick 22 unless Philly picked him at 18. So that's the first possibility. The other is that I think Green Bay could have easily moved up to 17 with the Chargers, going from 22 to 17 by using picks 22 and 59 to get to 17 and pick up that pick and then trade that pick over to the Titans the Titans for AJ Brown. So I think there's some other ways that they also could have made that work. Now, they may have lost Quay Walker in that scenario, which I don't love. I think he's going to be a really good Packer, but even in that situation, giving Green Bay a playmaker like AJ Brown, I think totally changes the dynamic of this team. I just talked with Ben Fennell and obviously Aaron Nagler, but in this specific situation, Ben Fennell, and I've said this all offseason long, Aaron said it all offseason long, like at some point you need to have guys that you can get the ball in their hands and they can just make things go. AJ Brown is that guy. He would have been the perfect playmaker for this offense. He would have been a perfect scheme fit. And he would have fit both the win now timeline and he still fits a long-term timeline as well. He is the absolute best of both worlds. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, all right, Andy, why now? Like, you've had all offseason to talk about what ifs. Honestly, it just sort of hit me as I was kind of looking at, sometimes these thoughts just come to me. And for whatever reason during the draft, I never really thought of it. I think you go through the draft and by the time that first round is over, you're just so excited to talk about Quay Walker and Devontae Wyatt and break down their tape. Like you don't even go over what like happened earlier in the draft or have things go through your mind. I was thinking about this and I'm just like, AJ Brown would have made so much sense. And I just sort of assumed too that like, all right, he got a huge contract. Green Bay couldn't have afforded it. But I went back and looked at the contract and they would have easily been able to fit this in over the course of the next few seasons. So timeline fits, salary fits, scheme fits. They get a playmaker, like everything seems to fit. And I know you might be thinking like, okay, this is just a reaction to week one. They, didn't play well against the Vikings and Christian Watson has a big drop. So now you want to go back and get, AJ Brown. It's actually kind of the opposite, to be honest, because I don't think AJ Brown does anything in that week one to change things. It doesn't fix their offensive line. The Packers offensive line was brutal and it just, like, I don't know if they would have had Randy Moss and Jerry Rice in their prime, that with that offensive line, the way they played against Minnesota, that it would have mattered all that much. Like, sincerely, that's how bad the offensive line played. But I do think having a guy where you can get the ball in his hands, get the ball out of Rodgers' hands quicker, probably have a higher level of trust, and just let that player do the heavy lifting. I do think that would have helped in that game and just helped long term as well. By the way, A.J. Brown in his first game with the Eagles with Jalen Hurts at quarterback, 10 catches, 155 yards. So, really impressive debut for A.J. Brown in Philadelphia as well. And how would that have, that roster have looked? Aaron Rodgers at quarterback, A.J. Dillon, Aaron Jones at running back, A.J. Brown, Allen Lazard, Romeo Doubs, Randall Cobb at wide receiver, Tunyon Lewis-DeGuara at tight end, eventually Bach, John Runyon Jr., Myers, maybe Zach Tom, Elton Jenkins along the offensive line. That's really good. And your defense would have been the exact same, minus probably either Devondre Campbell Devontae Wyatt or Quay Walker. And you probably would have had a second round pick to still get somebody in there as a best player available. Maybe, again, Travis Jones for, Devontae Wyatt. It may not have changed much at all. So the last thing I'll say here, and just to be abundantly clear, I really like the players that the Packers got. I think Christian Watson and Devontae Wyatt, if that's ultimately the two that they end up with because of this, because they don't go with this trade, I think both of those guys have the ability to be tremendous football players. And I think there's a decent chance that we look down the road 2, 3, 4 years from now and say like, man, remember when Andy wanted to trade, a first and a second for A.J. Brown? And they would have lost out on Christian Watson and Devontae Wyatt. And we're looking, and Christian Watson's a really darn good wide receiver, and Devontae Wyatt's a really darn good defensive lineman. And we might be looking at it and be like, man, like if any team called and offered an A.J. Brown type player for Christian Watson and Devontae Wyatt, Green Bay would laugh at them. Like that could be the case down the line. I really like those players. And if it's Quay and Watson that they lose because of it, that's even tougher. I think both those guys are going to be a tremendous player. But I do think at some time, you have to pull the trigger and make your team better with an opportunity to win a Super Bowl right now. And maybe this team can, and maybe they do, but I think A.J. Brown would have fit that narrative and that timeline a bit better and given them the playmaker that they really needed in this offense. So we'll see what happens long term. This could be what Brian Gutekunst and company did, could very well be the better long-term move, and maybe they still win in the short term. We'll have to sort of wait and see. But I think this would have been the ideal trade, the best of all worlds trade. They lose Devontae Adams, but they immediately bring in A.J. Brown. Would have fit with the cap, would have fit with the team, would have fit with the timeline, would have fit with everything. And yes, would have cost them a couple really good young players. Guess what? That's the cost of doing business and getting really big time players on your roster that can help you win and maybe get you over the hump and actually win a Super Bowl. Of all the great things that Brian Gutekunst has done, I think taking that one last stab, that one really last big step to get them over the hump, I think A.J. Brown maybe could have done that. Instead, they're going to have to really hope that these rookies are ready to go by the time the season is done to get them over that hump and be the playmakers that this offense desperately needs. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you for letting me fantasy book A.J. Brown to the Green Bay Packers. Always fun, these are just fun conjecture, right? It's not meant to be like Brian Gutekunst should be fired because he didn't get A.J. Brown. These are conversations that I think are fun to go over and sort of fun what ifs of, could Green Bay have been prosperous with A.J. Brown, knowing that he was available and knowing that they had the resources to go get him. That does it for me today. Always appreciate you. I'll be right back here tomorrow with Mike Wall. Make sure to check that out. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.